Good afternoon, everybody.
Hello.
Hello, hello. We have a few more people coming in, so we're going to take a few moments before we actually start, if it's okay with our guest.
Yeah, indeed.
Sure.
I'm fine with that.
And I see many familiar faces. Hello to all, hello to everybody, and even to those I don't recognize, welcome and good afternoon. So. And I hope that wherever you are, it's sunny and warm today. Anthony Riccio, is it sunny and warm where you are?
Okay, how about now?
Oh, much better, much better.
You asked if it's sunny?
Yeah.
It's never sunny enough.
Understood. We are from Naples, after all.
Yes, you know, the sun is stingy in New England.
Still beautiful when it comes out, right?
Yeah, yes.
All right. I think we can start now. We can. Does that work with everybody? Okay. All right. One last person here. So again, good afternoon and welcome to this one of our lectures for the Italian section in the World Language Department. Today, it is an honor and a joy to introduce to you attorney, teacher, playwright, and fellow New Havener Neil Thomas Proto. Neil is not new to Southern Connecticut State University. In fact, as many of you know, he graduated from our university. After graduation, Neil set out on a path for and achieved a brilliant career in the field of law, serving as an appellate lawyer in the US Department of Justice first, then general counsel to the President's Nuclear Safety Oversight Committee from 79-81, and later as a partner in private practice in Washington, DC. But this is just one side, one aspect of Neil's polyedric persona. He has published 2 books, one in 2006, titled To a High Court, The Tumult and Choices That Led to a United States of America versus SCRAP. He also authored in 2009, The Rights of My People, Liliuokalani's Enduring Battle with the United States, 1890-1917. Sorry, I'm admitting other people in. His published articles are too numerous to list, but they range from space exploration to the lives of Sacco and Vanzetti, T.E. Lawrence, and basketball. Neil is an active and recognized playwright. He's The Reckoning, Pecora for the public, about the causes of the 1929 stock market crash, premiered in Seattle in 2016. More recently, with other colleagues from Southern, we had the pleasure of reading Hourglass, his new play that focuses on the Italian-American experience and particularly the history of New Haven. His achievements are impressive, and I can't help but smile when I think that he said, and I quote, "I wanted to be a high school history teacher and could get into the program at Southern Connecticut." So you guys from the history department, you know, what did you do? Anyhow, today, Neil will guide us through his latest work, Fearless, A.Bartlett Giamatti, and the Battle for Fairness in America. Now, to talk in the abstract about Neil Thomas Proto does not do justice to the caliber of his output. So I invite all to listen attentively, to ask your question, and to join me, above all, in welcoming Neil to our school, to our university today, even though it is via Zoom.
Pina, thank you very much for your introduction. It is true about I couldn't get into the history department. As good fortune had it at the time, there was a small cadre of liberal arts students, and that's what I joined. And that turned out to be a remarkable difference in my life in terms of the direction I headed in. So there was something serendipitous about that failure. And of course, I did go on to have a teaching career while I was practicing law at Georgetown University for many years. So I did get to finally teach. I welcome this discussion about a person, A.Bartlett Giamatti, and a place, Southern Connecticut, that both of which are of special meaning to me and very dear to me. As you know, for those of you who read the book, including every one of the endnotes, our lives, mine and Bart Giamatti's, intersected. It was a moment when his Italian-American heritage took on a very consequential meaning to him, as it did for me. There were profound differences in our experiences, yet as I came to appreciate that heritage had mattered to both of us long before we met and deeply in our professional and civic lives, and in ways that often yielded very similar values about fairness, including, if not especially, empathy and its purpose. Though I was closer in time to the immigrant experience than he was. My mother was born in Southern Italy and came in 1916 in steerage at the age of 6. It mattered in my research and in my writing that I understood the immigrant imperative for striving, for defining your place and your family's place in America, and to be a responsible citizen. All of that played deeply as my research evolved and as I thought about the book, as I thought about him, and as then I put my thinking and research into words. So with that introduction and without spending a lot of time going through things you've all read about, I'd much prefer to get to questions and discussion about the book, or for that matter, anything else you'd like to ask me about, including my time at Southern Connecticut State University. So let's get to questions if anyone has any.
So perhaps I may start just generally speaking, and that gives people, the rest of people, time to think for a moment, because your book concentrates on New Haven and at a time when there was a whole big issue with the unionization, unions, Yale unionizing its or now wanting to unionize its members or some of the workers, right? And I'm thinking right now, and this is something that lately, because of what was going on with Amazon, I was brought, to link the two moments. So in your book, you give quite an explanation. You go into details about all of that, and I'm wondering if you could recap for those who have not had the opportunity to read the book yet, what was really at stake there.
Well, the history of labor at Yale University is sad and ugly, the early parts of it. It really begins long before Giamatti becomes president, and it's focused mostly on the university's position that there should be no labor union at a nonprofit institution. And this is emerging at a time at Yale in the 1930s and 40s, actually even a little bit earlier than that, when there's a parallel process going on, a parallel life going on at Yale, which is totally antithetical to precisely the people who were laborers at the university. That is, the Italian immigrants and their families, Jewish immigrants and their families, and African Americans and their families. And as you follow the history of Yale, you see how deeply that antagonism, that antithetical attitude towards them really gets reflected in a very condescending way. And it plays out at the university. Eugenics is just one part of it, but there's a fundamental condescension that's going on. It's both class-driven, it's race-driven, and do keep in mind during this time period, Jews and Italians were considered, Southern Italians, were considered a distinctive race. And so that plays out in a very rough way. And so you have some very contentious attitudes that are going on, and there's a moment when Yale could have taken a very different direction with respect to labor. And it didn't. This is under A. Whitney Griswold. It refused to do that. And so the antagonism only grew and grew, and labor began to form and organize. Now, simultaneous with this, within New Haven, independent of Yale, labor unions are being formed. And that's an effort led largely by women and the needle trades. And so you have, as New Haven becomes intensely more factory driven, especially tailors and seamstresses and just the general needle trades, it's the women that are leading these efforts. And as it turns out, although the unions generally were very integrated, the women, men, women, they were all working together, African Americans from Dixwell, New Hallville, and the Italians actually from Dixwell and New Hallville as well then, we're all working together, but it was the Italian women that were taking the initiative. And frankly, it was also a continuation of what they exactly had done in Italy before they came. And so the Southern Italian women organizing was, and labor unions was emerging at precisely the same time this antagonism is going on at Yale. So what you see, and you see it today, it's not something I cover in the book, but as you see it today, this connection between New Haven and Yale, one way it gets played out, in fact, the singular way it gets played out is through labor unions. It's not something I focus on, but you're hard put not to see that. There once was other ways that New Haven and Yale interacted, but the critical one now is labor. And that's the last remaining one that's of serious consequence. And it has a long history.
Erin, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I think that this is so interesting because if I think at the Yale, the attempts to block unionization when I was there, it involved the graduate student organization. And what was that if not a way to keep the graduate student body a more traditional graduate student body, that is, the children of independently wealthy people who didn't need to worry about healthcare and didn't need to worry about a living wage. So, I mean, it's interesting how it plays out with each generation, because that I remember the students who were the union organizers were the ones who came from families who were not middle class. So that I hadn't thought about that and you just made me.
Erin, let me pick up on that. Let me pick up on this notion about the way matters have evolved in a similar way and in a manner you're describing. In the book, if you go to the very beginning in the prologue, there's a wonderful photograph of Bartlett Giamatti's father, Valentine. And down the bottom, it talks about, or I describe this, and I'm just going to read it. It's just a few sentences, but I think it captures the beginning of what to me are themes in the book that evolve over time. And although they change form, they have these deep origins at Yale, and they're rough, they're ugly. And let me just read a little bit of this. Now, this is Bart's father I'm talking about, but it mattered. Everything I describe about his parents mattered to him. He also spoke Neapolitan, the dialect of the Naples region. This is quite appropriate for you and for the Italian department. He also spoke Neapolitan, the dialect of the Naples region where San Lorenzello, that's where they were from, was located. One of multiple dialects the newly formed government of Italy could have chosen as a national language, but did not. Neapolitan also was the only dialect his parents, relatives, and neighbors understood. Despite the compulsory directive of the public grammar school teachers to speak only the language of America, and the threat of corporal punishment if he violated the prohibition in their presence, he would not unlearn his family's language. His mother, otherwise fully literate, had never learned English. Now, there's another paragraph that I'll read in a moment, but this whole notion of denigrating the language, which was very painful for Italian Americans, Italian immigrants who came, it was a great loss. It was a great loss in the culture, but it was classic eugenics mentality, and that's the era that we're talking about, where how do you repress those cultures you don't want, you don't like, you want to keep in place? And language was one of them. It certainly is not unique to New Haven or Italians. I confronted this when I was at the Department of Justice, dealing with cases involving Native Americans. When I was the United States and the Secretary of Interior, and I had a series of cases out in South Dakota on Sioux reservations. And when I went out there, this question of language and the oppression of language by government and other institutions, missionaries, it's all part of this same Yale, such a critical factor in this mentality. I found that later when I dealt with represented Native Hawaiians, and to their credit, and Yale was involved in that as well. To their credit, they found a way of preserving the language. The elderly people didn't give it up. New Haven didn't have that. There was no way of not doing it. You had to go along with it. And so for me, I never learned the Neapolitan. My parents were so heavily pressured not to pass it on. And Yale was one thread in ensuring that in a lot of other forms. So you get this history. I mean, things changed later in terms of languages, but not for these Italian immigrants. It was a serious loss. But let me go on if I can. I'm sorry for Aaron, if you don't mind. One more paragraph. Preserving the critical thread in language in the families and his neighborhood's culture, resisting the force to abandon it was among the simpler duties Valentine insisted on fulfilling. From the moment his parents sought to disembark at Ellis Island, through his entrance into Yale's graduate program, he witnessed and felt a prejudice against Southern Italians that Northern Italians brought to Yale University. And the way that prejudice combined, it was amplified publicly and deliberately with the insidious Anglo-Saxon imperative for the purity of its own culture. Quote, "It seems quite clear," Yale President James Rowland Angell wrote in 1933, as he surveyed the Italian and Jewish immigrant and African-American population that surrounded the university, that if we could have an Armenian massacre confined to the New Haven district, with occasional incursions into Bridgeport and Hartford, we might protect our Nordic stock almost completely, unquote. This plays out throughout New Haven's history, and it comes from this mentality. It plays out in urban renewal when 30,000 people got moved. It plays out in the condescension, it plays out in the language, and it plays out in labor. So it is these two threads become a critical part of what Bartlett Giamatti learned. It's part of what was a thread in his life of consequence because it comes from his father. And he was very close to both his parents, but his father really was the teacher and the mentor. And all of that, of course, melds strongly when he comes to Yale as a student in 1956.
Are there questions from the audience?
if I could ask a question.
Please,
Great.
Jonathan.
So Neil, you know me well enough that I guess I have to ask this question. Certainly you give a great deal of, information and background to his mother's side of the family. What stood out for you, especially those kind of New England roots? I'm just curious, especially somebody who's, a native New Havener, because, her family is unusual in the sense of tracing it back to these New England ties. Did you see any elements of that within him that it kind of carried out even before he was president of Yale?
Well, yeah, the answer is yes. But go back a little bit earlier. Foremost, it plays out in his education. And you want to keep in mind, and I dwell on this in the book, that his mother was a Congregationalist. She was not a Calvinist. She had a very different attitude about America, about prejudice, and he chooses English as the subject matter he wants to study. And there's one thread of that comes from his mother. His mother spoke Italian. She studied Italian. As you know, the book begins with the way the two of them meet on their way to Italy. They're both going for different programs. He's at Yale and his mother was at Smith at the time. And so that melds together. It's not so distinctive, an imperative in his life. But it does play out. Later. And one of the ways it plays out, Jonathan, is Bart Giamatti, like his father, and with his mother's encouragement, they find this pathway through Yale. It's an intellectual pathway. It's how do you go through a school filled with such prejudice and bigotry, and for that matter, for most of its history, little regard for things intellectual. I mean, it's a total charade to think that everybody who got in on their merit, or for that matter, really explored and made the most of a Yale education. They didn't. It wasn't a priority in that school. So, but for Giamatti, with his parents' encouragement, they found that pathway. So it was, how do you fully benefit from the intellectual side of Yale, the faculty, the research opportunities, and not get yourself entangled in all this Anglo-Saxon prejudice and history and condescension and all that. So his parents, in that sense, turned out to be a very good balance. But that's in part because they had this solid relationship that was right from the very beginning. And one of the things that they were both acutely aware of and informed about, especially his father, but his mother as well, was Dante. And that whole history of the Renaissance was quite important to them. And so that plays out in Giamatti's life in very strong ways. I hope that answers your question, but it was informative for me to write it. And that's why I began the book where I did, where the two of them met on the ship going to Italy to study.
No, that was very well said. And as I said, I was really struck by those New England roots, which I think in my mind kind of stands out in some instances in this region. I'm glad you touched on that, because too often, so many of my students don't understand those Protestant ties and Calvinists. So the way you explained it was just very, appropriate. I think there's a misconception that, Christianity is all the same across the board when there are clear distinctions even internally in New England. So I'm glad you brought that out in the book the way that you did.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, Jonathan, because it was important to me as it struck me. And when I met the Giamatti family, and I spent a lot of time there, they're in New England mostly. And you could see these distinctions, how they mattered in their lives, and how strongly they broke away from any Calvinist kind of mentality, but how critical that Calvinist mentality was at Yale. It was important in my story and understanding them. Thank you for that.
Are there other questions for Neil?
Everybody must have read the book and understood everything.
That's what we say to the students when they don't ask questions. Yes. I see Tony has Anthony Di Pietro as a question. Oh. Which he's asking, but he's mute. So let me see.
I'm in my closet. I was a social technical worker at Yale University. Human side of the early and very active in it. At that time, we saw Bartlett.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, much.
Neil, I hear somebody else talking. Would you say,
Go ahead.
Anthony, I can see you and hear you.
there's somebody else appearing. Anyway, would you say that his experience as a son of immigrant was the same as yours due to the fact that they had already crossed over the line of being simple immigrants like the rest of the Italians, where the mother is already uplifted that low level that was not accepted in America? You understand what I'm saying?
Well, I may understand it. I think I do. Foremost, so we begin with the same set of facts. It was his father who was the son of immigrants, like I am, like my mother. But what happened to Bart Giamatti was that when he came to New Haven, he went from a setting in South Hadley, Massachusetts, that was a wonderfully warm community and very supportive of him. And frankly, he felt no prejudice there. And neither did his father. When he came to New Haven, his world changed, and he had very close relationships with all of his father's relatives in New Haven. And there were many of them. And they were much closer to the immigrant experience in the manner I think you're describing than even his father was, in the sense of they still lived in New Haven. And so Bart developed a very different sensitivity over time to what it meant to be Italian American, especially what it meant to be in the framework of this prejudice, this discrimination, not only directed at Italian Americans, but he got to witness it he was here during urban renewal. He saw what that meant in the Hill and in Dixwell Avenue, and Yale expanded as people were displaced by highways and roads, really to the benefit of the university. But he saw that form of discrimination firsthand in the context of family members that were here already. So I don't want to say that my sensitivity and his were the same. And I tried to say his experiences were different than mine, but we did share some values. And I emphasized this notion of empathy. I think it was critical to him. He paid a lot of attention to the notion of harm and prejudice directing at others, as his father did. And to him and to his father, it only enhanced his sense of civic responsibility to ensure, and as president of Yale, when he gets that position, to ensure that that doesn't happen to anyone, not just to Italian Americans or Italian immigrants, but to anyone. And it plays out strongly throughout the remainder of his life. It's part of what I was trying to allude to earlier about language, that what tempered me when I found myself getting these Indian cases out of South Dakota, where I had to learn a lot about the history, but more importantly, I could tell early on the manner in which the state of South Dakota was treating these Native Americans, these Sioux Indians, and that played out so I brought a certain empathy to that. There was a way as a lawyer, and keep in mind, I was the United States of America in those contexts. But there was a manner in which, as a lawyer, I could bring that to bear. The kind of questions I would ask, the history I was looking for, the law I was looking for, and how to argue it. So in that sense, it's that empathy and the purpose of empathy. It plays out, and it comes for me, and I know for him, it comes from this experience of discrimination, the harshness, the ugliness.
Yes,
what you
because you
learn
felt
from
it.
that, not only about yourself, but about others.
Yeah. I have another question for you. In reading the book, you talk about the father and introducing Dante and all these things, and the beautiful collection that he has left of Dante. Were the Americans in the 20s really susceptible to Dante and his teachings and the Divine Comedy? Because it feels as if they did not accept Dante until later on in life, or until somebody woke their minds up and say, hey, look, Dante is way up here than you guys believe he is. And then the fact that you mentioned that the Americans did not like the allegory, that he wrote allegories and all that.
I think, let me see if I can answer your question. I think I understand it. I think the teaching of the Renaissance and teaching Dante emerges actually in the public schools in New Haven earlier than I thought it did. So that, and it really fits into a broader notion of the Renaissance. It isn't, it was important to Valentine Giamatti foremost. He was quite taken by Dante and by the Divine Comedy. And he was his entire life. And I think for Bart, as he read it and he understood it, it took on another meaning. And that is the city. Dante as the responsible citizen, the civic duty of the private life. And I think for both Giamatti, for both Bart and his father, it was not just the poetry of Dante or the Divine Comedy. It was as well the life Dante led. It was the way he revered Florence, what he did as a citizen, the kind of aid and support, and he was in effect an alderman, or an alder, as it's now called in New Haven. But he was called upon frequently to deal with foreign affairs and foreign policy and a lot of delicate issues of importance to Florence. And so his role as a citizen was very consequential. I can say that at the time in New Haven, and I remember this, you may recall that in the book, there are a number of times when I allude to this dialogue going on within New Haven about where in purgatory to put Yale University and A. Whitney Griswold and Ed Logue and Dick Lee. I can tell you, there were a number of times I would go to events or dinners and that dialogue actually occurred. People were actually talking about that. And so it wasn't, I don't want to make it sound like it was commonplace, but that whole notion of purgatory and who goes there and for how long, it was actually discussed. And Yale was always and Griswold especially, but Dick Lee, Ed Logue were part of that discussion. Where do you put them? But in any event, it was Dante as the citizen and this whole notion of the civic duty of the private life, which was critical to Giamatti throughout his whole life, including while he was commissioner of baseball. Does that come to answer your question, Anthony?
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
There is a question in the chat box that would have kind of been a nice segue from your first question, Tony. but it's from Carlos Lebron. And I do want to ask it because he asked it quite a bit ago. He asked, would you say that living in New Haven has given you a clear insight on wealth disparity among different communities?
Wealth, is that what you asked? Like, Aaron, so I understood you. Wealth disparity?
Yes, the question is actually, it was dropped in the chat by Carlos Lebron. He said, would you say that living in New Haven has given you a clear insight onto wealth disparity among different communities? Thank you, Carlos, for your question.
The answer is yes, it did. I need to preface this by saying that my parents were very civically and politically active. In the book, I dwell a great deal on how powerfully urban renewal especially tempered every community in New Haven. And a lot of the institutions and organizations that originally in Dixwell or in New Hallville, certainly in Fairhaven and Worcester Square, that were intended to help these people, help immigrants, help migrants, help newly arrived African Americans, those groups turned out not to be sufficient enough to really deal with the disparities and the discrimination and the ugliness that was going on. That was falling heavily on different people in different ways. Although I will say urban renewal was pretty non-discriminatory in the sense of it didn't separate people out by race or ethnicity or religion. If you were in the path of one of those highways, you were gone. And if Yale wanted to take your property, New Haven would step in to help them. But I did learn a great deal. New Haven, and let me reiterate, my parents were very active, so I was active. And so politics became, understanding politics, understanding communities, understanding neighborhoods was a critical thread in New Haven's history. And once you develop that, once you get a sensitivity of what to look for, what's unfair, what's not right, and especially in the early years, in the framework of this book, so many of the major institutions in New Haven, the corporations, the banks, were owned by white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, many of whom were Yale graduates. And so you had to deal with that wealth disparity. And then there was segregation in the distinctive Yale wards were white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. It's where the faculty was, and it was where the old Yankees were, and then everyone else was kept at a distance in a very deliberate way. I followed today, the last few weeks, there's debates going on in New Haven. I get the Independent daily, so I get to read a lot of what's going on in the city in its way. But this whole debate that's going on in so many places about zoning, about neighborhoods, the deliberateness of the discriminatory zoning that came into New Haven in the 30s and 40s dealt with race, wealth, how to keep certain communities in a way that they wanted to. There's a long, ugly history of that, and it certainly played out in New Haven. But let me come to the more important thing, which once I left New Haven, once I started to deal with these other places, some of which I described, or for that matter, Washington, DC, my experience in New Haven so attuned me, it's part of this empathy, it so attuned me to what to look for, what do you recognize, what do you see as not right? And in that sense, New Haven is a great place to get educated. And I don't mean just formally educated, but it's a great place to learn a great deal about disparities in wealth and wealth disparities especially, but race, ethnicity, culture, and many others.
Thank you.
Did that answer his question, do you think?
Well, maybe we should hear from him. Carlos, oh yes, says thank you.
Okay.
Right. Now I see a hand up for Susan Voigt.
My car, so this has to be quick. I was a clerical and technical worker in the early 80s. When the union drive, it was ultimately successful for the white collar workers. was successful in 1984. And I was on the negotiating committee, and I continued to be very active in this whole affair. We certainly perceived Bartlett Giamatti as being very, very anti-union, and he became a very big personal target during the 10-week-long strike that we had in 1984. And I guess I know you talked a little bit about this at the beginning of your talk, but I'd like you to try to address it again within the context of empathy, because maybe we all missed the boat, but we didn't think he was very empathetic. And by the way, I am now a retiree taking Italian as Southern, so it somehow feels like some sort of full circle. Thank you, and I'm going to make myself mute. Thank
Susan, I should preface this answer by saying that at the very beginning of the book, I lay out what I can and cannot talk about. And my constraint was the unavailability of his personal papers as president. I didn't have access to those. And so the book stops with, I allude to some other things, but it stops before the time period you're talking about, except in sort of broad general ways. So I did not have access to his papers. To my knowledge, with modest exceptions, labor does not have an organized set of papers either. So trying to research not just what was said, but also what in fact occurred was not a task I could undertake as a historian. Now, I can say that there were a number, and from my own research, independent of the book, and what I was describing earlier was the framework of the Yale labor relationship that existed by the time Giamatti became president had been well established, and it was rough to begin with. There was more than one negotiation at Yale. The first one or two times that contracts came up, there was agreement. Giamatti was part of that. Labor benefited and did quite well. And in fact, complimented Giamatti on the difference between he and Kingman Brewster. Now Bart Giamatti had a history of good relationships with Yale, with labor before the strike you're talking about. And I know how ugly and rough that was. But again, I didn't have access to his papers to really make the kind of assessment other than newspaper articles and public perception, which really would not have told me enough to be able to write with the thoroughness I did for the whole rest of the book and insisted on. So I can't really answer I can't answer your question fully, except to say that when he first began as president, labor at Yale complimented him for the difference between he and Brewster. It then changed in some fashion after that. You're welcome.
Thank you. Jason, your hand is up.
Yeah, hi Neil. I'm at the with the history department at SCSU, and so I just wanted to say that I really enjoyed your book. At a certain point where you talk about this dual sensitivity, I saw really the way in which you were developing it, and it really came across nicely. And so I wanted to say that, but I wanted you in particular to maybe talk a little bit more about that quote from President Angel that you reference a number of times in the book. That is a really troubling, although not altogether surprising thing, given the time period. But if you could give a little bit of context for that, when he said he wanted it, or if he could just perpetrate an Armenian massacre, what did he mean by that? What was the context for that conversation? Who was he talking to, or who was he corresponding with? And what do you think he exactly meant by that? And then my other question is this, I think is a highly complimentary biography of Giamatti and his father, really, I think. Would you talk a little bit about what you see are, not to dwell on it, but their faults? What were their faults and weaknesses from your perspective as a biographer?
let me deal with your first question first. The exchange that the president had of Yale was with the dean of admissions. And what they were talking about at the time was who's going to be admitted to this school. And for all the control they sought to exercise, there were some limits to that control. And those limits came from things like the Sterling Scholarship, which Bartlett Giamatti's father was one recipient of. But the conditions of that scholarship required as many as 15 students come from what was then called New Haven High School, eventually becomes Hill House, and on this York Square campus. And so there was always discontent with the number of students that were being admitted to the Yale who were Jewish and Catholic. And you can see repeated efforts in various methodologies, including questionnaires and so on, to try to root out, not to exclude because they were already admitted, but how to monitor their conduct. And the people that we're talking about really were the product of precisely the races, the Southern Italians, the Jews, Eastern European Jews. They were the races that were so despised. They were the ones that were going to so infect and destroy this white Anglo-Saxon Protestant purity. And so for Angel, who had a long history, he was a very devout eugenicist, deeply committed, internationally known, and very direct about his intention. And he radically, dramatically, with a lot of cooperation, imposed that at Yale, including at the medical school. And so this whole notion of who are we surrounded by, who's in our neighborhoods, really mattered to him. And it mattered not only to admissions, it mattered to everything. There was one time, and you may recall it, where there was one student who was complaining about the arrival of fascists that were going to come from these young students who were going to come, fascist students from Yale, come from Italy who were going to come to Yale. And he directed the dean of admissions to do an investigation. Who was this student complaining? A local Jew was the answer. And there it was, couldn't have been clearer. So that mentality was very pervasive at Yale, pervasive for him, and it mattered. And it gets played out, sadly. I go back to it periodically because that's exactly what urban renewal did. And the mentality, this eugenics mentality, it was no longer we're going to institutionalize and sterilize people. We have a better way. We can now move them out in great numbers. Yale didn't care about urban renewal. What they cared about was how to expand their presence. And they succeeded in doing that. But there was a mentality that preceded it in the sense of, who cares about these people? They're not important. We could just move them out. And you can see in the way urban renewal evolved, where people went was of no consequence to Dick Lee or Yale or the people who organized it. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's a very ugly thread in Yale's history. And it has all the ugly meaning that you can attribute to it. With respect to Bart Giamatti, and for that matter, his father, Bart he had two things that periodically, it wasn't so much that they got him in trouble, I wouldn't say that, but rather mattered in the directness with which he dealt with people. One was, he had a very deeply held set of principles. And I try to describe how it was very impressive to me. He worked hard in his writing and in his reading, but especially his writing, about how to develop principles of conduct. And it mattered to him. And he gets that, it comes from Renaissance, it comes a bit from Dante, there's a lot of other sources to it, and his father. This whole notion of, what does it mean to be a civically responsible private person? And Giamatti really dwells on that, really focuses on that in his life. It causes confrontation. It causes tension. You can see it playing out where he wants you to be reasonable, reasoned, thoughtful. You need to be able to explain. You need to engage him. He loved being engaged. He didn't walk away from anything. He loved being engaged, but he expected you to engage him. And that cut in a lot of different ways for him. And the second was his health. He did not take care of himself. There was a long history of serious health problems within his family. And I don't think it was fully appreciated until much later in his life when his father had a heart attack. But then this inherited disease dealing with the extremities and so on. Once that he and smoking, and he smoked his whole life. That those things were not ones he dealt with. He didn't, or some he couldn't take, some he couldn't change, but his father actually was more aggressive about dealing with them than Bart was. So his health would be a second thing that I think was problematic. Let me come back to this first one though, about his principles. I'm now dealing, one of the things I've been doing is writing about baseball. And you'll see, I think in the website that got distributed, those articles have been posted. There's been 2 of them, there'll be a third about Giamatti and baseball. His principle, and I'm working on, at the encouragement of some people, on a podcast that deals with baseball. Well, you can really see his principles. You can see his commitment to a kind of way of living that he thought was important. It wasn't that he imposed it, it was that you have to live by standards. There have to be civic responsibilities. And he elevated those, and he did in baseball. And you can see it playing out in Pete Rose, which is the one he lived through, but he really anticipated much more of the problems that baseball is now having. But it all stemmed from these principles that were quite important to him. I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Go ahead, Erin, your hand is up.
I'm curious, you talk about John C. Calhoun and you talk about Samuel Morse, and both of whom had residential colleges, which you argue is, integral to this idea of cultivating, sustaining Mother Yale, this idea of the Yale man that begins with Stover at Yale. With the renaming of the former Calhoun College, and Morse is still Morse. How do you see this work within the context of that evolving conversation now at Yale?
You mean a conversation about changing names?
Well, the whole kind of conversation about, I guess, vexed monuments. As pertains specifically to Yale.
Erin, thank you. That's an easy question to answer. The answer is, it's not going on. It's not happening.
No, right.
And I'm not sure whether it's the passivity of the students. Maybe the pandemic has changed their attitude because they're not there. But these are factors that don't concern them. They don't seem to be focused on it. And the university is about as parochial and narrow as it's ever been with respect to these monuments. This Institute for Human Relations is still there. The names of some of these schools are still there. And stick with John C. Calhoun for a moment. The most solicitous person, the person who went out of his way to solicit Southern support, to ensure that John C. Calhoun was elevated, was Wilbur Cross. And he becomes the governor. Well, at Yale, and he was a eugenicist. He wrote about it, spoke about it, advocated it. And when he was governor, sterilizations just elevated. I mean, it was an awful time period. Well, Yale still gives, its alumni association still gives out an annual award in the name of Wilbur Cross. Now, I can't explain that, and I won't even try, except to say to you, it's part of the bubble that university has when it comes to itself. For all the liberalism that you tend to see among some members of the faculty when they're out accomplishing this or supporting that or working on this project or books they write. It doesn't, it's not something that gets internalized, not even close. And so Wilbercross still gets his award. These schools still stay, the names still stay, the Institute of Human Relations. When I was doing this research, it was one of the most engaging and interesting experiences to walk by that building, and it's still there. It's still up. It's right next to the medical school, which has its own very ugly, sordid history that it rarely comes to grips with. So the answer is not happening. You and I just had the most serious discussion there probably will be in New Haven on this issue. I don't know if that helps you, but that's
yeah, no.
it's
So
really
you,
quite
I mean,
remarkable.
do you think that they tried to close the chapter with the renaming of Calhoun, and now we're all going to move on until we hear something from the students?
Well, I
or
think
their
the
parents?
students are critical. No, I think the students are critical in this. And and so far, they've been very passive about it. And maybe that will change when they come back. There is an interesting thread. There's one or two students in the Yale Daily News who have written about Yale's contribution to New Haven, which was the subject actually of one of the articles I did in terms of the relationship between Giamatti and Delita. But Yale's financial contribution to New Haven. And he can't quite get himself, I read a few of the articles and then I stopped, but he can't quite get himself to the underlying issues of the history and how that evolved over time. Yale's, the ugliness, the harshness with which Yale dealt through with New Haven. But I don't see the students stepping up yet. This hasn't happened. They get right to the edge and then somehow they can't quite do it.
Thank you.
We have a question on the chat, which I will read for everyone, or you can also follow on the chat. It's by Gary, from Gary Conte. Do you think, Neil, that Italian Americans experienced more prejudice in New Haven because of Yale compared to the blue-collar cities like Bridgeport or Waterbury, with also large Italian American populations and no prominent university?
Yes, I think they did. But all of those communities were subject to eugenics and to the studies and to the institutionalization and sterilization that occurred in Connecticut in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. The eugenics laws in Connecticut don't come to an end really until I think 1970, when one of them is finally declared unconstitutional, and that's the end of it. But it goes on for a long time, and so those communities were all subjected to it, and of course those communities evolve in terms of who's in those communities, and so again, the eugenics was very racially driven, culturally driven, ethnically driven, wealth driven, and so that changes over time. But was Yale a problem? Yeah, it was very difficult. The history is so ugly, and I describe it, and I couldn't possibly do justice. There are times in this book where I'm quoting people, and Anthony Riccio, who I know is listening, does it with more eloquence than I do, where you really see how harsh, how difficult, how denigrating urban renewal treated the choices these people had, how dramatically it ruined their lives, families uprooted, homes lost, and most importantly, neighborhoods. There's one great quote in here from Vin Scully, who was an architectural historian at Yale, but is a product of New Haven, born in Dixwell Avenue. And he was in that area, and he was a sterling scholar. And the first thing he talked about with urban renewal was, and he fought it, was that Yale never understood neighborhoods. And those neighborhoods were Eastern European Jewish, Southern Italian, and African American. And especially as the migrant population got bigger and bigger in New Haven. And the harm to those people was dramatic and painful. I write about some of it. So the answer is yes, Yale has been harmful. It's one of the funny things about that whole notion that was very prevalent about Yale, and I write this in my last article about if it wasn't for Yale, New Haven would be Bridgeport, until Ben DeLito and others during the campaigns that then they ran, they said if it wasn't for New Haven, Yale would be the University of Bridgeport. And so you got a very tense, that simple analog mattered. And it says a lot about the tension that occurred and the harm that was done in New Haven by Yale.
Let's see if there are other questions. Thank you, Neil. And I hope that the answer was satisfying, Gary. Okay, but anyhow, let's see if yes, okay. Are there other questions? But meanwhile, while others are thinking, what I would like to ask you, so in the book, you do a beautiful job in describing what Bartlett Giamatti did when he arrived, when you took on the presidency of Yale. Would you just summarize for us, for those who haven't read the book, what are some of the things, in your opinion, that made a real change in the way that Yale saw New Haven or saw its own students and teachers' position?
I think there were a number of things of consequence. I can't say whether they lasted. I don't think they did. But foremost, he despised the fundamentally important notion at Yale that they make and train leaders. You hear it the moment you show up at Yale. It's in the literature. The president today still uses it. Levin used it. Kingman Brewster, it was the way he defined himself. Come to Yale, we're going to make you a leader. We're going to teach you how to be a leader. When you leave here, you're going to be a leader. Giamatti despised that. He thought it was exclusionary. He thought it was condescending. He thought it was reflective of an Anglo-Saxon mentality that he abhorred. And so he spent a good deal of his time talking about civic responsibility. What we want to do at Yale is create responsible citizens. We want you to go out in this world being responsible citizens so you can join with other responsible citizens and make a better America. Not that you're going to tell people what to do because you went to Yale and you're a leader. That mentality still exists, reemerged at Yale. It was a very contentious battle of his. But he speaks about that every time he speaks to freshmen, to graduating classes, he talks about that notion. It plays out in another way. He played it out in another way. When it came time to deal with gay students, the mentality at the Yale Corporation and among the alumni was very classic, condescending. They're not part of us. We don't want part of them. They're not like everyone else. We don't need to do anything distinctive or separate or special. Giamatti took the exact opposite position. This goes back to this notion of discrimination, and he's sensing it. It's not right. And so he takes a position that not only is contrary to what the corporation does, he gets out and gives a speech and says, I don't care what the corporation's doing. They don't want to adopt the policy of fair treatment, equal treatment, open treatment. I'm telling you right now, this is what the policy is going to be. This is what I'm going to do. And so he makes a very special commitment to that. It's all part of the same notion of fairness that was so central to him. And he saw it, when he saw it at Yale and it wasn't being done properly, he spoke about it. And his relationship with Toledo was very strong. He recognized, in the article I write, I'm sorry I don't have it in front of me, but in the article that I wrote, and I would encourage people who care about this to read it, I describe it as Giamatti really recognizing the history that I described in the book that we've talked about today. And how do you first repair it? And repair is the word I use. And then how do you battle to ensure that as you're trying to make those reparations, or you're trying to make that repair, you're also trying to battle to improve your neighborhood over the harm that Yale and New Haven caused during urban renewal. And so battle and repair, or repair and battle, is part of that dialogue with Toledo. But they become very good friends. And again, as I alluded to with my very first statement, this is a time when being Italian American mattered a great deal to both of them. They spoke frequently in Neapolitan and in various other dialects, including Model Italian. Toledo had a great grasp of words. And so they had a wonderful, close relationship. And they would refer to each other by their first names, Biagio and Angelo, when they could in private. And so that ethnic connection that mattered to the both of them in important ways in terms of how do you make New Haven a place where we can all live together and Yale can play the role that that it should. Well, that lasted only for Giamatti's term. And, but it was quite important to both of them. But Giamatti insisted on that role. And it was not popular at Yale, except among some people, but not among the university. And the moment he left, you could see this resurgent back to the same kind of detached, condescending attitude, which the university still has.
Aridia, I see a hand up. Am I pronouncing?
Yeah, hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I can hear you.
This is actually Jeff. Did you, just a follow on to that, did you get the sense that Mr. Giamatti's, desire to do the right thing by these groups that were marginalized here, that do you get the sense that he got that kind of, because he felt like he was part of that Venn diagram of groups, as the Italian immigrant, let's say, that Venn diagram of groups that were being discriminated against?
Oh, I think that I'm not sure I fully understand your question, but let me see if I can answer it and then you can tell me. His mentality, his sense of civic responsibility has a thread that that emerges out of his awareness of discrimination. And that is an Italian American experience. That is an Italian immigrant experience. And he understood that. And once you start with that, a lot emerges. And it makes no difference who the groups are or who the people are. There's an empathy that comes with that. And Giamatti played that out in his whole life. It was one of the reasons he and Toledo got along so well. Toledo was very popular all over New Haven. And Giamatti knew that, but so was Giamatti. I only allude to this, I think, in the book, but his Bart's father and his grandparents, towards the very end of their grandparents' life, and just for a short period of Bart's father's life, they lived in New Hallville. And they moved from Fairhaven to New Hallville. His aunt lived in New Hallville. So he'd go there into that neighborhood weekly for Sunday afternoon dinners. And so there were friendships very close to the Jewish community, when in New Haven it was much larger than it is today. So it wasn't so much groups as it was the empathy that came from this notion of discrimination and this imperative to ensure fairness. And it was such a central part of his thinking about what life was supposed to be like, what the responsible citizen was supposed to do. So it's a thread in his life. It plays out in his conduct, and I think it did during his time in New Haven. He makes a very deliberate effort, even as a student, to walk the streets, to be close to people, all the neighborhoods, and really to try to understand what was going on in the city, which now includes, when he returns in '56, relatives, a lot of them.
Great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So, Fran, your hand is up, please.
Yes. Earlier, I had a question about Pete Rose and the baseball thing, but I'll hold that to when you write your next book.
Well, you should ask me. I'm actually very focused on it right now because of this podcast thing, but go ahead.
Well, I was just interested in what sort of the fallout of that was with Pete Rose and changes that had occurred in baseball and then other sports as well. But I had another question about currently, so both. What were the difficulties he had in getting elected or chosen to be president? Was it smooth or contentious? And with all this going on and his difficulties with Kingman Brewster and all of that, who were his champions and how did that even happen? The first.
Well, that's a wonderfully good question. And some of it I think I understand and know, and I'll describe to you what I do know. There were members of the Yale Corporation for the first time who were young. There was Strobe Talbot, who had been at the State Department, but was a Yale graduate, had studied under Giamatti. There were at least 2 Jewish members of the Yale Corporation. Their names escape me right now, but I think I reference them in the book. They were intent on a change. And the person they wanted was the dean of Harvard College. His name was Rosowski, I believe, and he was a very prominent dean. He had no connection to Yale. He was Harvard College, Harvard Graduate School, dean of the college, very prominent. He very publicly refused. He said no. And he said no because Yale had very poor financial situation. Brewster left the place fiscally a mess. And he didn't want to be, he said publicly, I do not want to be the first Jew anyplace. I'm already a very successful Jew at Yale. I mean, at Harvard. And so I'm not looking I don't need to do any more of that. So Giamatti was always on a list and they were looking for a departure. And so it wasn't, his advocates were Talbot and a few of these Jewish members of the board of the Yale Corporation who wanted the change. And he was a very popular teacher, very interesting professor, highly regarded, and very erudite. Was a Boston Red Sox fan. I don't know, and I say this in the book, I don't think they fully understood what he was going to do or what he would be like. But he was a change, and they were ready for a change. And that's really how it came about. There were others who were quite jealous of him and who worked hard not to get him to make the appointment, who thought it was their turn or they needed to be it, but it was him. I don't know if that helps you, but that was, Fran, but that was the.
Does, thank you.
Yeah.
Are there other questions, comments?
Pina, let me go back to Fran's question for one moment. There's one comment I want to make that I think is important, and I make it in the book, and that is that Tony Giamatti, Bart Giamatti's wife, was the first wife of a Yale president to have a professional life.
I read that.
It had never happened before. And there's this wonderful dialogue where he's asked that question and he answers it in the perfect way, a thoughtful way, but in one sense quite commonplace, which is he said, well, my wife has got a profession. She's a very good English teacher. I ought to know. That's what I've been doing my whole life. And so she's going to continue to do exactly what she wants to do. But she was the first one to not fit into that Anglo-Saxon mode of, you know, teas in the afternoon and early drinks and all that kind of stuff.
It's like
yeah, I didn't mean, I wanted to be sure I said that to you.
Yeah, I just picked up the book on Saturday, so I have certainly not read a lot of it.
Well, you'll enjoy that part. You'll enjoy their history.
Actually, it's funny, and skimming through, I did read that part earlier today.
Yeah, you will. You will.
One part.
And you'll also enjoy, I think, the history of theater that goes back to both Bart's grandparents and his own parents, and then works through he and his wife, and then you can see, of course, today and his sons. So there's a long history of that thread too in the book that I talk about.
Of course, you see that with our president's wife now, having a.
Yeah, yes, that's right. But anyhow, she was the first one to be have this professional life.
Jason, back to you. Go ahead.
Yeah, Neil, what is barring you access from Giamatti's papers? Is it a top secret security clearance or what?
Pretty close. No, it's that Yale prohibits them. I think it's got another 5 years to go. It's sort of like 50 years after his presidency ends. What I did have access to were his speeches. Those I got. And so you'll see some of those are alluded to in the last 4 or 5 pages of the book, in the epilogue, in the endnotes. Those I got, and I'm using them now for, they play out in baseball, and they also played out in the article I wrote about Yale and New Haven, because he talks a lot about Yale's relationship to New Haven in various speeches that he gave. So I did have access to that, Jason, but not to the papers that would matter for a historian to really make the judgments I wanted to make and did make in those 100 pages of endnotes that I included.
And you said that's common practice for Yale administration?
Yes. Yes, it's not unique to him.
Okay.
Kingman Brewster's are now available. I use those. I had plenty of access to those, but not to Giamatti's.
You mentioned what came after Giamatti. What was it? Benno Schmidt, was that the next president, or was there time in between? And was there kind of a corrective? Do you think the corporation did something? Was there kind of a return to order after Giamatti's presidency?
Yes, I do. Benno Schmidt was there for a short period of time, was commuting daily from Columbia or New York, and I don't think much cared. And I never quite understood why they made that choice. But the whole notion of leadership was a very powerful force within the alumni. And although Giamatti had great success in balancing the budget and getting more, actually leaving a huge surplus at Yale when he left. And so convincing the alumni to give up money. Nonetheless, that whole notion of the more conservative Yale, the elitism, the detachment, that mentality about leadership, the answer is yes, it came back. If you listen today to the current president, he uses that term all the time. And I had a very interesting, when I wrote the article about Yale and New Haven, about Giamatti and Toledo, that was published and got circulation. The way I learned the article had been published was that the mayor called me. The mayor of New Haven called me. And that's how I learned it was published, to thank me for it. But what he talked about was, and I've never actually physically met him. I mean, we've had a couple of exchanges, but he talked about how the current president of Yale only wants to deal with transactions. He's very focused on, well, if we need something, we'll talk to you. Or if you need something from us, you talk to me. But nothing else. And so that mentality, when I talked to John DeStefano about his time as mayor, and he was mayor for a long time, it wasn't as if Levin was a man of the people. It wasn't like he went out like Giamatti did and spoke to dozens of different groups all over the city. And Bart was constantly, made no difference what the group was. It could be African Americans, they could be Jews, they could be Italians. He was, whoever invited him, he was there. That all stopped. And it stopped. Levin was not like that. He too was a transactional guy, except that he and DeStefano had a long period of time over which to work out transactions. Well, that's now become much more the norm. And so it's, what do I need? Can I talk to you about it? End of discussion. Rather than the broader relationship, which is precisely what the mayor needs and wants, and New Haven needs and wants. And it's difficult. They're having a hard time getting it. Yale's having a hard time giving it.
That would lead to so many other questions. But for the time being, there is one on the chat, which I will read to you. And the first one is, do you think you might write an epilogue when the archive is opened? And that's from Susan, who asked earlier on a question about Bart Giamatti.
I think it's highly unlikely. I say that because in my life, there are a lot of other things I'm trying to do and want to do. I have been writing these articles, these two about baseball, the third one about Yale and New Haven. There will be this podcast I'm talking about. All of those deal with areas and subject matters not covered in the book. And I will continue to do that for a while, but I don't expect to do another one. What was important to me, and maybe this is a partial answer to the question, what was important to me is that by the time that book got written, whoever writes the next one, and hopefully somebody will, they have the benefit of this one. That what I did was to do the kind of research necessary to stop all these illusions about Yale University, what a wonderful liberal place, look at all the great things they do, but really to dwell on this history that now can no longer be neglected. And including especially Giamatti and who he was. The pretense, and I can't begin to tell you the number of interviews I did where especially people who were at the university or on the faculty or previously on the faculty, the difficulty they had being civil about Kingman Brewster, and yet they couldn't do it while he was president. The mythology around Brewster was quite remarkable. It was like he had his own public relations effort by others, but he was not the person that once you get into this history, and it wasn't just that I wanted to expose him. It wasn't that. It was that all I had to do was document facts. All I had to do was my 100 endnotes. And so that's what Yale's got to deal with now, not just with the book, but all this documentation that comes out of their own archives. They never talk about eugenics. You never hear that discussed. It's an ugly, vicious part of that university's history, but it's not something they want to talk about. Well, anyone who writes about Yale now is going to have to deal with it because I did. And I dealt with it coming out of their own archives. So the short answer is no, I don't think I'm going to do another one, but whoever does it has got to deal with fearless.
There is one other question, if I may, and it's on the chat. Again, from friend Gwinnell. How similar or dissimilar in other smallish college towns like Princeton, Dartmouth, with other nationalities in those cities?
What are the differences?
Or similarities do you think exist with what you've just described about Yale and New Haven in places like Princeton or Dartmouth, where those universities would present? Do those only, yeah.
Let me, in some of those places at Princeton, I spent time in Princeton because Giamatti taught there after Yale. It's like being in, it's a lovely campus. And it has its own history of eugenics that's very ugly. And there, I will, to the university's credit and to the student body's credit, they came to grips with Woodrow Wilson and some of his conduct. But their history is pretty ugly too, with respect to the way they treated African Americans, immigrants, et cetera. But being there is like being in Disneyland. They took the town surrounding Princeton, and they have just totally converted it so everything looks the same. It looks like you're in some manufactured world in order to make it civil and comfortable. It's very pretty, but it's a creation, and frankly, you can see. And I don't mean to get too current into New Haven, but you can certainly see it. You can see Yale doing the same thing. It's like a Rouse shopping mall. They're trying to create. They've created up on Upper Chapel Street and up near that whole area near the university. It used to be so diverse. Used to be local stores, all gone, and everything slowly starting to turn into a Rouse shopping mall. So you see universities trying to do that now. I can say that in Boston, Harvard had a more difficult time. I'm sure everyone's aware of, Columbia had its own struggles with the way it kept acquiring land and then finally ran into serious resistance in the late 60s and 70s. Again, students leading that effort. But Harvard developed a very different relationship with Cambridge and then with Boston, and money mattered. They did something Yale didn't do. And it's in the book. And it embarrassed Yale whenever groups would go off and study Harvard. Let's look at Harvard as an analogy. Let's see if we can find something that would be helpful to us. It hurt them because Harvard was giving Cambridge and Boston enormous amounts of money. Whenever they would acquire a piece of property that they would likely be converted to being non-taxable, Harvard would pay 20 years worth of taxes first, and then they would acquire the property. So that, and they had different relationships with their students. Somehow Harvard was much more thoughtful, and I don't want to elevate Harvard as somehow being an example of precisely what you should have, but Harvard was much more thoughtful financially in terms of its dealings with Cambridge and Boston, and Yale would just be embarrassed by those comparisons, and so never pursued them, didn't like them. And I write about that as well. Yale is hard. This Anglo-Saxon history and the Calvinist history and the leadership notion makes them as an institution not a very good neighbor. And you can see that play out in so many ways that make it very hard for the city, and the city is dealing with this. And every mayor has had to deal with it since the harm that Dick Lee did, and Yale with urban renewal, and Griswold, and Brewster was part of that as well. They've all had to somehow still deal with the harm from urban renewal. They're doing it every day. They're still doing it.
There is one last comment on the chat, and I will read it. And it comes from, I think it's Jeff Dorworth. So it sounds like you were saying that even today, Yale is not really interested in making amends to the citizens of New Haven. Or am I missing something?
No, you're not missing a single thing. And if I've conveyed that, thank you. That's precisely what I'd want to convey. It is not happening today, and it's very frustrating for the mayor. It's frustrating for the people in the city. And it isn't that there aren't, Yale's got a hospital. People are able to go from the city, go into it. But of course, it's the hospital in New Haven. So it's not like there's any gratuitous, we're going to do something special. But the kind of relationship you'd want from Yale as an institution is not occurring. And so it does continue. And it's one that the mayor, I know, and others are daily try to come to grips with. And then in small ways, every time I read an article about a neighborhood group in New Hallville or Dixville or Fairhaven trying to improve their neighborhood, almost invariably that improvement is a result of that. The need for that improvement is a result of urban renewal. How dramatically those neighborhoods got changed, how much got lost, how much the highways changed things, what you had access to, how streets stop abruptly, buildings that were destroyed that were perfectly usable, that were in good condition. And so these people in the neighborhoods are constantly trying to improve their lives. And it really comes back to that era. And Yale's nowhere to be found in terms of being supportive and helpful in the way that they easily could afford to do.
All right.
Thank you.
Oh, that's Aridia there. Hello, Aridia. Hello. Thank you. Is there one last question or comment? We've gone well beyond the time that we had originally planned for this, but this has been so rich and thought-provoking. I can't thank Neil enough. Oh, there is one more hand up. Terry, go ahead. So I take back go ahead, please.
Okay, yes, just one quick question, sir. You talk about you're working on a podcast about baseball and everything. Could you give us just a little more details about that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I hope it works. It's a bit of a new adventure for me. It's really about, Giamatti gave it's very interesting. And I'm going to do my best to use his voice in this podcast. So it's not going to be me or a few other people talking. He talked a lot about baseball when he was at Yale, not just the more prominent articles he wrote, but there were a couple of panel discussions that he was involved in with Peter Uberoff, who was then the commissioner, Roger Angell, who was a well-known writer for the New Yorker magazine. And he spoke a lot about the future of baseball and cheating, and in ways that are so reflective of precisely what happened long after he left baseball, long after he died. The Houston Astros and Boston Red Sox. And so the podcast deals with, and he gave these wonderful speeches, which have really never been focused on in a serious way, at the University of Michigan Law School on baseball, or on sports, but really on baseball. And so the podcast deals with his ability to not only deal with Pete Rose, and deals with Rose, and something. I spent some time at the Baseball Hall of Fame in my research, wonderfully supportive and very helpful, and I still have nice exchanges with them. And they have a copy of the book and thanked me for it. But there's some very interesting materials there about what was going on in Pete Rose's life financially that haven't been disclosed, that were very interesting. It's sort of the greed, it's sort of the ease with which he and others just embraced this selfish greed. It had nothing to do with baseball as a game, and how that has now metastasized, how that's grown in baseball, and how much baseball has changed. So it deals sort of with that. We're still in the forming stage, and some of it's been written, and we're still trying to work out some aspects of getting as much of Giamatti's voice into the podcast as possible.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
you're welcome.
Great. Thank you so very much, Neil, for, as I was saying before, this exceptional talk about New Haven, a city which, after all, we know and really don't know, and even more so Yale, this entity that is there and, seems to have quite a few hidden secrets, but thanks to you, they're now out in the open. And hopefully, I still remain positive that you will write the next chapter. As I've said to you, your book unfortunately ends where it should begin, and I keep pushing that and hoping that it will begin. The next book will begin with the documents that will be made available. But meanwhile, join me in thanking Mr. Neil Thomas Proto for this very, very thought-provoking conversation this afternoon. Thank you. We are grateful and look forward to hear more coming from your corner.
Pina, thank you very much, and thank everyone as well. I look forward to coming onto the campus again, hopefully,
yes,
maybe in the summer or the fall for certain, and spending more personal time with the people who are on this discussion. Let me just add two small things that I think might be helpful. One is that, as I allude to in the book, Bart Giamatti's father actually attended New Haven Day Teachers College for a period of time when it was the predecessor to Southern, when it was down on House Street. And it was really to get a teaching certificate is what he was looking for. So there is that connection. And as you may know, the very first time Southern Connecticut gave an honorary PhD in its history was Michael Adante gave it to Bart Giamatti. And as good fortune had it, I found a 30-second clip buried in between something about Yale and speeches and so on. And totally by accident, there it was, Michael Adante giving the PhD to Giamatti. Giamatti gave a speech, and the students saying, "Take me out to the ball game." It's a pretty awesome 30 seconds. It's quite full, but it was it brought tears to my eyes. It was I remember the time period. I was in Washington at the time, but it was a special event in Southern Connecticut.
Nice.
I wasn't there, but I can imagine. Yes, yes. All right. Thank you again, everyone, for being with us this afternoon. And, you know, big applause for
Thank
Neil.
you. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, yes, yes. Neil, it's been a real
Thank you.
pleasure. And you know, with the things that you've told us and explained, you know, some of us had read the book before, but you made it come to life, and that's.
Tina, thank you very much. And let me just mention one last thing too, and that is that Ben Delito and Bart Giamatti and Michael Adante and I had lunch together at Southern, and it was the way the four of us, Giamatti and Michael, were very close and good friends, and it was a special moment for me to sit around the table with the three of them and talk about life and politics and government and education and all that.
Sure.
In any event, thank you. I hope to see you again soon.
Yes, for sure.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye. Bye, everybody. Bye,
you.
Anthony.
Go.
Bye.